Hi, I'm Miss Becky from West Chase Music School. In this video, I'm going to talk about going beyond the notes. So what does that mean? That means, so you know how to play the notes and rhythms. How do you make it more musical, more expressive beyond that, and beyond just what's written on the page? So to do that, I'm going to demonstrate kind of my process for getting to know a piece that I've been working on for a while. I'm going to use my clarinet. The piece is called Carol. This is the third movement from a song called Five Bagatelles by Gerald Finzi. Just kidding, Finzi. And there should be a picture of the score either in the comments or somewhere attached in this post, so you can take a look at the music along and follow along. It's pretty simple. It's for clarinet, so there are a lot of ledger lines, but it's just treble clef, so it's not too difficult, and there's nothing, there's just a couple of 16th notes, but mostly it's eighth notes and quarter notes and half notes, so it's not too difficult. Yeah, so take a look at the score while I'm talking. You won't need to see me for a while. If you want to just look at the music, that's a good idea. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do whenever I'm getting to know a piece, first, you want to make sure you know what tempo you're going to play at so that you've been practicing correctly the whole time. So this particular piece is written in 1945, and anything after late Beethoven music, so around 1830, 1850, somewhere around there, you're most likely going to have a metronome marking at the beginning of the score. So mine, you may notice, has quarter note equals 92. So I'm going to pull out my metronome, which I've had probably for longer than a lot of you have been alive, because I've had it for 15 years. I'm going to set it to 92, and I'm going to get my tempo. Okay, I like to hum along a little bit, make sure I'm really internalizing the tempo, make sure I'm playing it correctly. Because playing it at a different tempo than is written is going to throw you off the whole time, and you don't want to do that. So make sure you're playing at the correct tempo. If you don't have a tempo marking that's that specific, you'll have some kind of phrase at the beginning that says andante, allegro, allegretto, something like that. If you have a metronome, this one has a list of tempo ranges on the back. I'm sure you cannot see that. Maybe a little bit. Kind of, whatever. So here it says andante is between 76 and 108. So then it's really up to your interpretation to choose what feels best within that range. But make sure you're using the right tempo first. That's very important. Okay, so I know how to do that. I've learned the notes and rhythms based on that tempo, but what do I want to do beyond that? So I find it's really important that I know what the piece is about. So, so do a little bit of research. Something you can look up, program notes. If you go to an orchestra concert, or if somebody's doing an hour-long solo recital, they will provide a program. The program, tells you what they're playing, but with the program comes what we call program notes, and that's basically just gives you some background on the piece. It tells you if it's a vocal piece, it will give you the words, and if it's in a different language, it'll give you a translation of the words so you can know what is actually happening in the music. It might give you some context for the composer's life. So for example, with this piece, Gerald Finzi, he used some small motives or themes that he'd kind of had rolling around in his brain for, he says, almost 20 years, and he finally developed them into a piece. So it uses some simple phrases, stuff that he'd had for a while. And then I also learned that this piece, it's not supposed to be a concerto or super virtuosic where it's showing off a really complex technical skill. I'm not trying to play super fast and super impressively all the time. It's really supposed to be a little bit more simple and show some different characters of the clarinet. So it's going to show other movements are going to have different styles. This particular one is very simple, very serene, and it's really just supposed to show that beautiful tone quality of the clarinet. So there's that. Now the most important thing that I learned, probably that's going to play the biggest role in how I'm going to perform the piece, I learned that it was written to be paired with a poem. The poem is called Winter Now Has Bared the Trees. I am guessing that was written in a different language and that's a translation. Otherwise, I think it's an odd name for a poem. But either way, Winter Now Has Bared the Trees. That's going to give me a lot that I can pull a lot from that to come up with a story for the piece and how I'm going to then structure and like tell the musical story while I'm playing. So right away, I know this piece is called Carol, so I was already kind of thinking of Christmas carols, Christmas time. We live in Florida, we don't have winter. I mean, we don't really have winter, but we don't have snow. But I did spend a couple years living in New York, where it does snow over the winter, and so I'm kind of picturing something like a snowy, the leaves are all off the trees already. But before I get into the story, I know that I'm going to have that in my mind, and I'm going to get more into the story later on. But first, now that I have that, and I've learned that from the program notes, I want to do a little bit of analysis of my piece. So, if you take a look at the picture below, here, I'll hold it up really quick. So, take a look at the beginning. Here we go. It starts with a C. The first note is C, but then at the end, the very last note, that's a lot of ledger lines. I'm not sure if you know how to read ledger lines that low, but that note is a G, so it ends on G. So right away, that's a little bit odd to me, because it looks like it should be in C major, but the last note is G, and generally pieces are going to end on the home note, not the fifth note of the scale. So, what does that mean? You may not need to go this far into detail, but for me, I'm a music theorist. I got my master's degree in music theory, so I really enjoy analyzing music and really knowing what's going on. And since this piece was written in 1945, it's relatively modern, and I know during that time period, composers were using different types of scales. They were trying to go away from just major and minor and bring in some other elements, basically to do something different, because they had hundreds of years of this tradition of tonality where everything is a major or minor key, and they wanted to do something different. So in my analysis, I believe that this piece is actually a Mixolydian scale. So I'll play that for you on the piano. Using the white keys, this is just your 7-note scale that starts on G. So it sounds mostly like a major key until you get to the 7 and back to 1, because there you should have an F sharp, but we have an F natural. That's your F sharp, that's your major key. And then there is the weird note. So here, now I know G is my home note, and as I play through it, I see that there's a lot of kind of emphasis on C, but also a lot of emphasis on G. So I think this is a Mixolydian scale, and okay, that's good to know. Then I know anytime it's emphasizing G, it's emphasizing the home note, and that can be important and play a role in how you phrase a piece. The next thing, you kind of want to think about how the piece is organized. Is there a main theme that comes in at the beginning that then you'll see repeated later on? In this particular piece, let me play the first measure for you. So that's going to be the main theme. It's the first measure of the piece. So it's the first thing. And that comes back one time as we're going through it, but it's at a different octave. It's going to come in lower. So that's on the third line after the words a tempo. So the third measure, if you're following along. Okay, so I know that that's coming back in. So it's almost like an A section, basically. So it's good for me to kind of find those things, like this theme that's coming back more than once, because probably I want to play them similarly. But I also want to see, is there something that the composer is doing to make it different? So the first one here is marked mezzo piano. The second one is mezzo forte. So there's already that difference. There's also the difference of octaves, so they're changing what range it's played in. So here, let me show you that. So there's our first measure, our mezzo piano, and then it comes in, where does it come in? It comes back right here. So we've got a mezzo forte under cantabile, And then there's also the word cantabile. So that's a new marking as well. So I may phrase it very similarly, but I'm going to start at a higher dynamic, which means every time I get bigger, it's going to be a higher dynamic. And then I'm not going to come back all the way to like a mezzo piano. I'm going to only come back to that mezzo forte. So it's good to think about that. Yeah, and then beyond that, there's not, it doesn't come back that theme again at all throughout the piece. So, but I know that now. It's good to know that. All right, so once I've done that, then I kind of want to figure out what's the story that I want to tell. So because I did the research on this piece and I found some good information, and it happened to come along with a poem that gives me the story. I mean, it gives me something to take inspiration from. That's really convenient. So I'm already thinking winter. I'm thinking calm, smooth, kind of quiet. I don't know if you've seen snow, if you've grown up in Florida, but when there's a heavy snow, everything gets really quiet. It's so weird. And I've only seen snow a few times, so it's still really magical to me. So the whole piece, I kind of want to emulate this quietness as I'm going on. Now, if you're like looking at a piece that you don't have a story to tell, that they didn't give you, or that none of your research is coming up with a story, there are other things you can do to make up a story. And you definitely want to have a story in your head, because if you don't, it's kind of hard to figure out where you're going with the music. And we want to know where we're going with the music. So, there's a couple things I'm going to look at. I know the first line is just kind of an introduction, and then it's repeated with the same thing, but a little bit lower, a little bit louder. But before I go into the second phrase or section, there's a retard, and then it says a tempo, which is means a minor tempo change, and that's really up to your discretion. It might be a little bit slower. Since it's following a retard, I probably would play it just a teeny bit slower than I was playing the main phrase. And then we add the word cantabile. Cantabile, so anytime you see any type of words like that, you want to make sure you know what they are. So look them up. I have this pocket manual of musical terms. I don't even know. I got this a million years ago. But we also have the internet, so, Google it. Go to the Google, as I like to say. But make sure you know what those words mean. So here, cantabile, that word means like in a singing manner. So it's like mimicking a singing voice. If you're playing an instrument where you can do vibrato, that's a really good time to start adding in more vibrato. So the clarinet, sometimes you might use vibrato, but it's more uncommon. But because it's cantabile only in the second phrase, I may play, and then the first phrase is marked andante semplice. I looked up the word semplice. What that means, it's simple, it's unaffected. So for me, that sounds like it's going to be very calm, very smooth, there's no vibrato there. But I might add some more vibrato on the part that's supposed to be more singing, because when I think of a singing voice, I like to hear a vibrato in that, which is just like a kind of a shaking, I guess. Let me see if I can demonstrate. So, if you heard the shaking, that's my vibrato. That's not how I would do it, because I was trying to be a little bit more dramatic so you could definitely hear it. But that's something I might add stylistically. So if you play violin, if you play a woodwind instrument, that's something you can add. If you play like a guitar or the piano, that's not going to be in your grab bag of musical techniques that you can add, unfortunately. So you'll have to come up with different ways to make it sound more like a singing voice. But for me, that also would be more smooth and connected. So I'm going to use more air and make it as smooth as possible. So that's kind of my plan going into there. Okay, then after that, there's not really a whole lot. There's another retard, another a tempo, but then we come in with a secondary theme. It's a different melody. It's not the same as the first two lines. But something I do see is I'm reaching some notes that are higher than any of the notes I've played so far. So let me point that out to you. So here, so this line, these last couple measures, I see a high A and a high C. You may notice I've drawn an X above both of those. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But I can already see there, the shape of the melody is changing. So that's something else you can look for when you're thinking about what kind of story you're doing or how you want to phrase it. Is there a really high point? Is there a really low point in your melody that you don't usually go that low? Or it's like one of the few or only times that you reach that high or that low in the piece. If it is, then you probably want to emphasize it and think of it as an aiming point. So here, that's going to be my high C is going to be the climax of the piece. So it's going to be my loudest note. It's going to be the loudest note for a couple reasons. One, because it's written as mezzo forte, but also, which is my highest dynamic. There are a couple other mezzo fortes, but this one I'm going to play it even louder, partially because high C on the clarinet, if you don't play it loud, it can be very difficult to get it to come out. So it's going to naturally be a much louder note than other notes on the instrument. But it's also the highest note in the whole movement. So I want it to feel like a place, like we're arriving at a climax, like something exciting is happening. And this is a very calm and smooth and serene piece, so it's not going to be the most dramatic, most exciting thing you've ever heard, but we want to have some sense of like reaching a high point. So let me play that phrase for you, and I will demonstrate kind of what it's like to get to that high note, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of understand if there's an emotional connection or something that's going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the third line from the end. And so I'm going to play that whole line that has that high C in it. Highest note, the high point. That seemed pretty loud to me, so I think probably got the point there. But something else I did when I got to that note, I added more vibrato than I normally would, because I want to give it as much color and as much life as I can, because it's the high point. So that's what you want to look for. You want to look for those high points and those low points and what's interesting that's going on. So based on all of that, so after that, there's a lot of really soft dynamics. I have only piano and mezzo piano, pianissimo, and then pianissimo, so 3 Ps. So once we get to that high point, everything's just coming back. So we reached the climax, and now it's just fading away. So how might I tell a story if I don't know what's going on? Because it's called Carol, I would have thought something to do with winter anyway, because it makes me think of A Christmas Carol. So I'm going to imagine walking through the park in the middle of winter. It's just snowed. Starts off, it's not snowing, we just had a heavy snow. So there's a lot of snow on the ground, it's really quiet, and there's not very many people outside. People usually like to stay home on snow days, it's really cold. So it starts off kind of just cool, calm, smooth, not with a whole lot of emotion. The second phrase, when we go and repeat the same melody, but it gets a little bit louder and more singing-like, so our cantabile phrase, we're building up to something. It's getting a little bit more interesting. Maybe we started getting a little bit of a snow, like a light flurry, and so for me, whenever I saw snow falling, I just thought it was the most magical thing in the whole world, because I've only seen it a few times. And so maybe as they're going on their walk, they pause for a moment, and they're now like full of like childlike wonder. So they're like looking around, and maybe they slowed down so they're not walking as fast because they really want to enjoy the moment. And I'm thinking about like people spinning in the snow. It's fun and cute. But then it's quiet again. We start with pianissimo, and we're getting quiet. The pianissimo happens at the beginning of the phrase that's going to eventually lead into my really high note. So once I get there, I'm probably like, we're getting soft because we're getting close to like the most exciting part of the walk. We know maybe at the end of the path that we're walking on, we're going to come out of like the darker kind of woods into a place where there's a lot of lights, like it's warm and yellow, and maybe there's people playing there, and it's like a more exciting place. Like that's the destination. That's where they're going for their walk. So we're going to start soft because as we get softer, we want to kind of hold it down, and like we now have this anticipation of the climax and what is to come, and we're getting closer. So we want to kind of rein it in and like, does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And then as we get closer, we start to see the light just a little bit, and as we get closer and closer, it gets brighter and brighter, and that's also as we're getting louder and louder, until we arrive to the place where like children are playing, and maybe this is exactly where everybody goes to like have a snowball fight or like get a hot chocolate or something like that. And so once we've arrived, that's the high point, okay? And then as the piece ends, there's just a couple lines left, and then the whole song is going to kind of come back, and just get softer and softer and softer. Then the very last line, if you're looking in the score, you can see the words dim, al fine, and niente at the very end. Dim al fine means diminuendo to the end. So for the rest of the song, it's just getting softer and softer. That's easier than writing a really, really long decrescendo. Just putting a couple words instead of long lines. And then niente means nothing. So what that means is once I hit that last note, I'm going to start. It's already triple piano, so pianissimo, and I'm going to fade to nothing. So that's like the end of the night. You've had this great day, you had your walk, you got your hot chocolate, and now you're going home and you're going to go to sleep, kind of thing. So that's the story I would tell with this piece. And you can put that in any context. It doesn't have to be based on the name. It can be, this melody makes me think of fairies, so I'm going to come up with a storyline that the music makes me think of, and I'm going to tell that story. And your audience doesn't have to know the story that you're telling. They just have to know that you're trying to tell them something. So that's the other thing you want to think about. Not only am I telling the story so I have an interpretation and kind of know where I'm going and where I'm coming back from, it gives me like a goal and aiming points, and I need that in order to really like make the music say something. Like I need to be going somewhere, and then I just have to know where I'm going. So you need to be able to tell a story. But the other important thing is your audience doesn't have to necessarily know the story, but they have to know you're doing something. So part of coming up with how to go beyond the notes, how to like tell that story, is thinking about how your audience is going to perceive what you're doing. So if I'm starting mezzo piano and then I'm crescendoing to mezzo forte, for example, I want to think about, will the people in the audience be able to hear what I'm doing? Am I making a big enough difference between my mezzo piano and my mezzo forte that they can tell what's happening? Because if they can't, then you might as well not have done it. So you got to make sure you start soft enough and you get loud enough. For example, that's very important. And I'm also not going to start pianissimo at the beginning of this piece because it starts mezzo piano. So if I start too soft, when I get to the end, I'm not going to have anywhere to go because I have to also have the ability to get lower. So you have to think of that. You just have to know that your audience is going to be able to tell what you're doing and that you're doing something. I guess I just said that 3 times in a row, but that's okay. Now, something else to think about, though, is in this particular piece, it's very smooth and serene, so there's not any, there's not going to be any, like, sudden accents or, like, jarring moments. So I also want to think about what am I doing that could potentially be jarring to my audience or make them uncomfortable. And a lot of the time that is entirely wrapped up in how I'm going to start and end notes, or how I'm going to start and end phrases. So if I just went, so I'll just play the beginning, and I'm going to not end my notes in a way that I think is nice. Like something that I'm trying to make it jarring. We'll see if it comes through. come naturally to me to like end notes in a jarring way, so it hopefully you kind of got it, where like at the ends of the phrases where the slur ends, sometimes I clipped that note really short, and it wasn't beautiful. So you really want to think about if you're taking a breath or if you're pausing for a moment because there's some kind of rest or pause built into the music, or if you play an instrument like the clarinet where you have to take a breath, you have to have pauses so you can breathe. It's very important. We don't want you to pass out, so you have to breathe. But at those moments, you have to think not just, am I going to have time to breathe here, but you have to also think, how am I going to end this note so the breath isn't, or the pause isn't going to disrupt the phrase, isn't going to bring people out of the music. Like, you want them to stay, like, enraptured, right? You want them to be, like, captured by the music and really into it. So you don't want to disrupt that in any way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure the ends of every note or every phrase is, like, tapered and, like, fades at the end. And you can do this quickly or you can do it slowly. It doesn't matter how fast you taper. It just has to sound like a finished note. So here's that first phrase with the notes finished. So I'm just not ending abruptly ever, because abrupt endings, don't like them. Unless it's written in the music that you're supposed to end abruptly. If I had accents, or if I had a sforzando, or if I had like a marcato, which is it's like, it looks like this, it's a little caret, and that's a combination between an accent and a staccato, so it's short and accented, then I want to do that. But I don't have that in this piece. So anytime you have long notes, anytime you don't have staccatos, basically, you want to make sure you're tapering that. But even a staccato, you want to sound nice and round and light. You don't want it to be, like, ugly and clipped. Like, it still needs to be, like, a round note. So think about how you're ending notes. Think about how you're starting notes. Because if I make it, like, my oboe professor in college told me you have to prepare the note that you're going to play. So when I go to start, I'm going to, like, have my whole embouchure set and have my air and be ready to go. And I'm not just going to, like, take a breath and just blow. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to pause for just a second before I start to make sure everything is set. So it starts nicely. Instead of going, it's just not quite as, there's not quite as much, like, finesse. It's not as nice. So take a moment to prepare the notes also. You want to make sure you're starting with just as beautiful of a sound as you are ending the note. So that's always really important for me. Yeah. Now, actually, I took two pictures. So there's one which is a totally blank score and one that has some pencil markings in it. So when you want to go beyond, for me, I've been playing music for almost 20 years, which is a long time, and more than half of my life. And a lot of the phrasing and musicality is stuff that comes naturally to me. It's second nature because I've done it for so long. But for those of you who are younger, it's probably not second nature yet. It's still something that you're practicing. So the most important thing you want to do is write everything in your music until it happens naturally. So the second page that I have markings in, I've gone in and I've written X's and I've written crescendos and decrescendos everywhere because that's how I want to phrase the piece. So I use that X. What my X means, that's the loudest note I'm going to play. So when I'm crescendoing, I'm going to continue the crescendo all the way to that X, and then I'm going to come back. And then I'll start the crescendo again, all the way to the next X, and come back. So your music is, when you're making music, it's pretty much always going to be doing this kind of hairpin crescendo, decrescendo, possibly the opposite, where you're just starting loud and getting softer, and then coming back. It's always going to be this give and take between your softer and your louder. And then, so that's what you have to write in, and you have to think of it. So how do you figure out where you want to aim, basically, is the question that you're probably having. How do I know where I want to draw an X? Well, part of it, sometimes is going to be based on what crescendos and decrescendos the composer has already written in for you. So in this case, I know that I'm starting mezzo piano. He doesn't put the crescendo until the end of the first measure. So probably we're going to keep going. a lot of the time, there's a couple things I look for. Is it like the highest note in a phrase? Usually I'm looking for the highest note in the phrase, because a lot of the time, phrases have more of this kind of like mountain or like hill kind of contour, where they're rising and then coming back. People often kind of will describe that as music as having like the force of gravity, where we like to come down, descend back to our home note. So like, sol, fa, mi, re, do. Like a lot of melodies will end on do after some sort of descending gesture. So in that case, a high point is what you're looking for in most phrases. So a lot of the time, it might be the highest note in the phrase. It might be a chromatic note. So if you see an accidental, a note that's not in your key, that's something interesting. That's something different that's happening that the audience isn't expecting. So you might want to emphasize that note. So you might put the X over that note. Make that your goal. This particular song has no accidental, so I don't have any examples of that right here. But if your piece does have accidentals, you want to bring them out. You want to bring out the chromatic notes because they're interesting. They're different. So I'm choosing the highest note most of the time, but not always. In my second line, right here in this last measure, my X is not over my highest note. The highest note of that measure is the A, and I've put the X over the F. And now the reason I've done that, there's a couple reasons. One, so this song is a little bit weird because it's in 6/4, so there's 6 beats per measure. And in 6/4, it's interesting because some of them are 3/2, some of them are 6/4. So when there's 6 beats in the measure, that third beat feels like it's stronger. When there's 3 beats in the measure and the half note gets the beat, beats 1 and 3 feel stronger. So it kind of depends on the measure. He's playing with meter in a really interesting way. Don't worry if that doesn't quite make sense to you. But for me, when I play this measure, let me play it for you a couple different ways. So I'll start with the pickup note starting on E. So the 2 eighth notes leading into that last measure of the second line. So that time I kind of aimed for that A. But for me, when I play it that way, it feels like I'm getting too loud too fast. It doesn't feel quite right. It feels like the emphasis needs to come later. So I'm going to play it again. This time I'm going to continue the crescendo all the way to the F, and then start my decrescendo after that tied note. See, I like that a lot better. It feels more balanced to me. So, something that you'll need to practice is being able to identify where the musical phrase is. Where does it start? Where does it end? Because once you know where the phrases start and end, then you can find like a midpoint, a high point, and add in those markings. So that's one of the things you want to do. Let's see. Let me check my notes really quick. Alright, then you also, with these phrases, so I used the same phrase markings. I put the X's basically over the same note for the second phrase, because it's the same thing, just at a higher dynamic level. So I can do this kind of crescendo and decrescendo thing at any dynamic level. So if I'm starting really, really soft, I'll just play the same phrase, and I'm going to pretend, like, I'm going to start at pianissimo and get a little bit louder, and then I'll do it if I'm starting, say, at a mezzo forte instead. So this one, starting pianissimo. So in that context, it's not going to get extremely loud. You don't want to go from your lowest dynamic to your highest dynamic in every single phrase. Then it's going to be way too much, and you're not going to enjoy playing it either because you're going to be working really hard, and it's a lot. But so it happens in context. So let's try it from a higher dynamic now with the same kind of level of crescendo and decrescendo. didn't get quite as soft at the end because I started at a louder dynamic. So it's always going to be balanced. It's always going to be like, it's like in proportion. So you want to keep that in mind when you're practicing with these phrasing things, for sure. And no matter how loud and soft you start, you're still always going to end that last note, like taper the end of the note so it's nice and fades at the end, so it's nice and not jarring. Yeah, so let's see. What else? Okay, well, I'll do a couple final tips, and then I'll play the whole song for you, so you can kind of follow along, hear what I'm doing, listen for my louder and softer notes and things like that. Yeah, so, but a couple tips that you can do, like, one is record yourself. So I talked about, you want to know, like, what your audience can hear. You want to make sure your audience is going to perceive what you're doing. So something that you can do, you know, if you're sitting in a practice room, you're probably not in a practice room, you're probably sitting in, like, your living room or your bedroom, practicing, record yourself and then listen back and see if you can tell where you're getting louder and softer. If you can't hear it, you need to make a bigger contrast, and because your audience won't hear it. If you can't hear it and you know what you're doing already, your audience is sure not going to hear what you're doing. So record yourself, listen back, and when you listen back also, don't just listen to see if you can hear the phrasing, but also you want to listen and point out what sounds good to you. Like, is there a part that you really like the way you played it? Do you like what you played? It's really important. I had a teacher one time who I played something, and he asked me, did you like what you played? Or what did you like about what you played? And I was like, what are you talking about? I made all of these mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. That's part of being a musician. But you can't only build on the things you're doing wrong. You have to build on the things that you're doing right. So when you listen to what you're doing, point out all the things that you like about your sound and build on those. Build on the nice things. You want to play beautifully. You want people to feel something when they hear you. And I guarantee you're doing a lot of really great things. So point them out to yourself. Get in the habit of pointing them out to yourself, because that's what you have to build on. Something else that's really helpful is listening to other performers. If it's a piece that, like, if you're doing a piece from a book, you might not be able to find a great recording of it. But if it's a piece that's written, like, part of our, like, normal repertoire, you may be able to find somebody performing it on YouTube. Listen to what they're doing. See if you like their phrasing. I've heard lots of recordings where I totally disagree with what they're doing. But it's good to get a different perspective, because every person, like, we're all human, we're all different. So we're all going to play things a little bit differently. So if you can, listen to other recordings. You can listen to 1, listen to 5, however many you can find. It's really up to you. But listen to what other performers are doing. Make a note of what they're doing differently, or that if they're doing something interesting you never even thought of. Make a note of that. If you can find a performer who does a lot of things that you really like and you want to emulate them, it's great to have, like, that sound of, like, a great clarinetist, for example, or a great violinist, a great pianist in your head as someone you want to emulate, because you have to know what a good sound is before you can make a good sound. So listen to other performers, and eventually, as you get better, you'll have, like, stronger opinions about these things, and you'll find that you disagree with performances a lot. But it'll take a while for you to get there. But when you do, it's a good feeling. And then just, like, some final tips also. You may notice when I play, I move with the music. And there's not really a formula for that. Like, I'm sitting in a chair. I'm kind of in an awkward place. When I perform, I prefer to be standing up. But you don't want to, like, dance around the stage, you know. You don't want to be, like, stirring the pot with your instrument. Like, you don't want to be too crazy, because you don't want to be distracting. But moving a little bit with the music will also help you kind of phrase in your head. So if you're getting a little bit louder, or if you're going higher, you might raise your eyebrows. You might make faces. You don't want to make crazy faces, because you don't want to distract your audience, but moving a little bit, like, is good. So, like, it just helps the music feel more like an extension of you, not just something that's happening at your fingertips. Like, it's all part of you. Because that's really what it is. So, yeah, I think that's all of my tips. Now, I would recommend, so find the picture of the piece that has the X's and all of the pencil markings. There's not a whole lot, but follow along in there. I'll play you the piece so you can kind of hear how I'm phrasing it and see how I'm phrasing it as well. There was one thing I had written in that I didn't point out. In this third to last line, oops, 1 second. In the line at the end, so third to last line, I've written in a little NP in parentheses. I don't know if you can see that, but if you can see the picture, you can find it. So right there, the phrase that eventually is going to lead into my high C, my climax of the piece, it starts pianissimo. And then there's a bunch of crescendos, but there's a little bit of a decrescendo right before I go up to that high C. And the composer gave us that. So I wrote in a little MP right there because I'm not going to decrescendo all the way back to pianissimo before I go up to my high C, because I don't want to... Well, so I've had like 3 measures of crescendo already. I'm going to bring it back because that phrase is ending, but I'm not going to go all the way back to like my lowest dynamic. I'm just going to go a little bit back so I have somewhere to go for my G into my high C, but I don't have to go super far in 2 notes, because you can't make a huge, beautiful crescendo in 2 beats. So you have to think of these things. How far back do I want to go as I end this phrase before I go up to the next level dynamically? So that's why I've written that in there. And normally I wouldn't write that in because that's something I just naturally know how to do. But I put that in. I wanted to point that out for you. Yeah. So I've been talking for a while. I'm going to play it now. And we'll see how this goes. Yeah. I hope you enjoy. So I'm telling a story of a walk through the park in the snow, then slowing down a little bit because it started snowing and there's some wonder, and then getting really soft as I'm getting to the place where all of the people are and there's hot chocolate. And then I'm going home and going to bed. So think of that as you're listening. So I hope you enjoyed that. My chops are actually very tired, so had a little trouble on that high C, sorry about that. Because I've been demonstrating so much that now my lips are tired. Because that's a muscle, it gets tired. If you're not a woodwind player, that's what's happening. But I hope that helps. I hope you learned something. And I hope you go make some beautiful music. Thank you for watching.